This is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, and this is the final episode of our series in the Great Papers of Stephen Malkin, the 10 Great Papers. And I give them 1 through 10. Doesn't mean they're ranked 1 through 10. I just chose his best 10 papers and then just randomly started talking about them. And so this is the last one. If you'd like to know more about Stephen Malkin's background, that is given in the first episode. Stephen Malkin was, in my opinion, the world guru in grinding. A lot of researchers did very good work in grinding, but I suppose Malkin's work is the best, in my opinion, because he always studied things from first principles. He gave us the reason why. He didn't do a bunch of experiments and said, hey, look, I got a bunch of results. Look what they are. He said, hey, I did a bunch of experiments. Now I'm going to try to understand them from scientific principles of Newton's laws of motion or mechanics or fracture mechanics or grit, workpiece, contact, stress and strain, and first principles of heat transfer, everything else. And this is measurement of hydrodynamic forces in grinding. And this is something that just doesn't get much attention even now. 30 years later. It was done in 1995, and it's something that I have to deal with a lot with my customers who are trying to achieve tight tolerances. They go, hey man, I got a workpiece and I got to be plus or minus 2 microns or plus or minus 1/10,000th of an inch, and I'm having trouble. And I said, well, you're going to have to start considering the coolants, not as coolant, but you're going to have to start considering the coolants as it's kind of like when you drive down the highway, and if it's raining and you hit the brakes, you're going to hydroplane over the highway. The grinding wheel is hydroplaning over the workpiece. And you got to consider that, because the force pushing up on that wheel and pushing down on the workpiece can get pretty damn big. And depending on the stiffness of your machine, that's going to cause deflection. If you got an ID wheel, it's going to cause taper, because it's not going to deflect like that. It's going to deflect like this. Lots of other issues that can make things difficult. And Malkin was the first to study it, at least to my knowledge. And he did it right, and he measured the vertical force with the dynamometer. And he did it, here we have different passes. He measured how it changed. He changed the wheel velocity and says, okay, is the force, I just call it the hydroplaning force, but Malkin broke it down into the impingement force and the hydrodynamic force. And they say, okay, is that changing with wheel velocity? And if it is, we need to know that. And then is the impingement force changing with wheel velocity? And then does it depend on the grit size of the wheel? Because small grit wheels typically have less porosity, big grit wheels have more porosity. So we've got to figure that out. Then Malkin changed the wheel velocity and then the vertical hydrodynamic force, because he's taking out the impingement force. And then he's being clever about it, and he's changing the depth of cut throughout so we can isolate the different forces. And then he's doing it, here's the hydrodynamic force versus the wheel velocity again, and other stuff. So I actually spent a fair bit of time on this paper, and I extracted the data, and then I give it in the book of grinding, where I talk about, okay, what's the impingement force, which does not depend on the wheel speed. And then what is the hydroplaning force or the hydrodynamic force, which does depend on wheel speed. And then how big is it? And then how do we cope with that? And then one of the ways we can cope with it is not cool very well during spark out, which is not great because we're not going to lubricate as well. And then we're going to suck away a little less heat, but then we're not really sucking away much heat in spark out anyway. And then how do we cope with that? And there's no right answer. It's kind of G.I. Joe's knowing is half the battle, but just knowing these forces exist and then knowing that I can reduce them by turning down my coolant or coping with them based on the fact that I know they exist and then changing my depths of cut based on that is very useful. So this is really almost very few people have done good work on hydroplaning forces. There are papers where people have gotten into these theoretical fluid mechanics stuff, and you'll notice Malkin didn't do any fluid mechanics in this. It was all experimental. He just said, here it is. I'm not going to get into the hardcore tribology fluid dynamics of it. Probably knew his limits because fluid dynamics gets complicated quickly. He just said, hey, here are the results and here's what those forces are. And so if you have, let's say, a 50 millimeter, 2-inch wide wheel, you can have a 50 kilogram, 100-pound force pushing up on your wheel. Easy. And then how do you cope with that? And that's only due to cooling. So when you spark out and you reduce your grinding force, you haven't reduced your hydroplaning coolant force. You've just reduced your grinding force. So this was fabulous work, and I spent a fair bit of time plucking from it and then putting into the book of grinding because it's very relevant to my customers who need to cope with hydroplaning forces, especially when they're trying to hold tight tolerances. So this is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, and that concludes our 10-part series on the great grinding papers. Some people may disagree with me and say, no, man, you left out this paper. This is really one of Malkin's greatest papers. Or, no, man, paper number 4 is not that good, but this other paper you didn't do is really a better paper. And I'm not necessarily even going to disagree with you because it was tough to figure out his best 10 papers. And those are his papers. Stephen Malkin, world grinding guru, may he rest in peace. May he rest in peace. And he still has a strong influence on the world of grinding today. So this is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, concluding my 10-part series on the great works of Professor Stephen Malkin.